Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today in this video we are going to talk about Linux kernel. So in this video basically I would be discussing what's Linux kernel, history of the Linux kernel. Basically we'll talk about a little bit of history, how it got developed, and then we'll see the difference between the Linux kernel versus operating system, Linux OS, right? So when we talk about Linux as an operating system, so what's the role of the kernel over there? We'll see that as well. And then what exactly our Linux kernel do? And at last we'll see some of the real world use cases, where it is being used, why it is important and all. Okay, so yeah, let's start with Linux kernel, right? So most of you would have used Linux as an operating system. You would have used Ubuntu, CentOS, and if you are working, so even on the Mac, you would have Mac OS, right? So and all of these operating system, right, like whatever the applications you run on these OS, whatever you do, so how those OS talks to the hardware, like how it gets the resources like CPU, memory, right? How the network calls happen, like who does all these things behind the scenes. That is something the kernel comes into the picture. So you can think of kernel as a middleman between the software and then the hardware. So you have the operating system, right, and you have applications running over there. So it gets the resources, right, from the actually by talking to the kernel, and kernel allocates the CPU, memory for each of the processes, right? So let's see it over here. So basically Linux kernel is a core part of the operating system that directly talks to the hardware, right? Provides services to the applications, manages resources like CPU, memory, files, and devices. So here I have a one simple diagram. So there you think of you we have a Chrome application, Chrome browser application, VS Code, or any application, right? You run on your OS. So basically, whatever how like how it talks to the hardware, basically that is through the Linux kernel. So this is the one which is important, which is the middleman between the software and then the hardware. So let's take another example, right? Suppose I'm running ls in my terminal. So I have my virtual box, Unix virtual box, and I run ls in the terminal. So what it does basically, the terminal, the cell which is being used in the terminal, that cell will send a request to the kernel. Kernel will fetches the data from the disk, basically. So when you run ls, that means the listing of whatever files or directories you have in that current directory, right? So basically kernel will fetch all those data, and then it will sends back to the basically gives back to the cell to display. This is how it happens behind the scenes, like when you run any of the commands in your terminal. So you can think of kernel is the brain of the OS. That means it does everything for the operating system. So in the OS, you can think of OS as a whole car, like which have seats, steering wheel, wheels and everything, and kernel is the engine of that car. So let's talk about a little bit of history, about the Linux kernel. So basically, it was developed by Linus Torvalds in 1991 as a free alternative to Unix, one of the first OSs that allowed users to interact directly with the computers. So now if you look today, like fast forward to today, Linux runs everything, like on Android phones it is being used in self-driving cars, in supercomputers, in cloud servers. I think you have used, if you have used any of the clouds, so for all the computes, most of the computes, you would have seen that it's run, that's powered by Linux itself, Unix itself. You would have used Amazon Linux, AMI. You would have used CentOS, so different OSs, right? So that's like Linux is being used over there. So in today's world, if you see most of the things like even for a corporate, right, they run their production servers, and if you see most of their production servers, like whatever I have seen, like most of them are like Linux box. It's running on the Linux, any flavor of the Linux they would be using, but yeah, it's running on the Linux one. Okay. So now let's move to this part, that is Linux kernel versus operating system in Linux OS. I think we talked about this particular thing. So what is the difference between, because people get confused between the kernel, when we talk about Linux kernel and then the Linux OS. So they get confused. They take, they understand basically, the term is confusing for them. Like they get confused. What's the difference between basically Linux operating system? When you talk about Linux, so that means they're using the operating system. When you talk about kernel, so that's a part of the OS, right? That's not you can that's not separate from the OS. That's a part of the OS. So as I talked, right, as I said here, so Linux kernel, that's a core brain. It does the process management, memory management, drivers, etc. So you use any of the Linux operating system, you would have used Ubuntu, Fedora, Red Hat. So how how the OS, basically, if you talk about it, that's OS is a superset, right? So it has kernel, it has system libraries, it has user utilities, and different apps. So that's how it is, right? So you have all of these things which make the operating system as a whole. So I talked this part as well. So you can think of a kernel as the engine of a car, right? And while OS is the whole car, like you have a seats, you have a steering wheel, wheels, everything you need to actually drive. So here I have made a simple diagram, okay, which basically depicts what is the operating system as a whole, and what's the kernel, and what's the role of the kernel in the OS. Here you can see this whole big circle. You can think of this as so we have this operating system, right? This is like we have this is as a OS. Okay, so here I have several things running. Like we have different applications, we have different softwares running, we have different processes running. So these all are the different processes, like date, grep, you run you have different compilers, you have different applications. And after that, like basically you can think of we have a cell, and then we have a kernel over here, right? And then you have the hardware resources for that OS, like you have a CPU, memory, disks, and etc. So whenever you run any of the, suppose I'm running my command called date, right? So that you run that command in your terminal. What does cell do? Cell sends the signal to kernel. Kernel basically basically gets the whatever the informations for it accesses the hardware, and gives you the result back. So that's how it does it. Okay, so this is what the role of kernel over here. So you could have a different processes running. Now we'll see like what exactly kernel do. What does kernel do? So it does different tasks. It serves different purposes. So it does the process management. It does memory management, uh, device management, does the file system input output, and then the obviously it does the networking. Okay, so let's talk about each of them briefly. So in the process management, it decides which process gets the CPU time, how long it runs, in what order. So basically, right, that's what it does it. For the memory management, it allocates RAM to the processes and manages virtual memory. So this is the task of kernel, which does the memory management. The device management, it acts as a translator between the hardware and then the software. So any request you get from your software or your application, that gets translated to the hardware, so that hardware can understand because hardware does not understand the high level language. It will only understand the machine level language like zeros, ones, right? Suppose if I say something like uh, play a song, right? So how that particular high level language gets converted to the low level, and how the system understands basically I have to play the song. So that's how the kernel comes in between, and it translates that high level language to the machine level language so that machine can understand it, right? Then you have something called file system and input output management, which controls how files are stored, read and written. And networking at last, the kernel does the networking. It handles the data transfer using protocols, different protocols. It uses TCP, IP, UDP, right? So these are the different overall, if you see here, they are the different tasks of your kernel, which does different, which serves different purposes as per their needs, right, as per the request it gets. So let's talk a little bit of real world use cases, right? So as we talked, as I said earlier as well, so it's being used in the Android phones, powered by that Android phone powered by Linux kernel. We use in the cloud computing, like most of the, I think, if you have used cloud like AWS, Azure, GCP, and if you have used their compute services, right? Most, I think, if you would have probably you would have used Linux machines over there as well. If I talk about smart devices and IoT, so smart fridge, Wi-Fi router, even Tesla cars runs on the Linux box. And then the supercomputers, so 90% of the world's fastest computers, right, that are being powered by Linux itself. So overall, Linux is widely used in the in the industry, in the and kernel is one of the core component, which does all the tasks for that particular OS behind the scenes. So yeah, that's all about this video. I just wanted to make it very short, and just discuss about what's kernel, what are the different, and little bit of history of the kernel, like how it got developed, who developed it, what's the difference between the Linux kernel and then the OS, what does basically kernel do, and what are the use cases, real world use cases of the Linux. So yeah, that's all for this video. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, please subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. If you have any suggestions, do let me know in the comment box. I will definitely work on that. Thank you.